I don't know about you, but I find the Islamic concept of government, Islamic politics, to be absolutely fascinating. It's such a, in many ways, a radical alternative to Western secular liberal concepts of political theory or political philosophy. And I've come across this book. I think I might have mentioned it before, actually, but this is the work, Islam and Politics by Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani, who's still very much alive and teaching, to be very insightful and clear as to the role of politics in Islam. I just wanted to share with you just some paragraphs that I think are particularly helpful to clarify the radical differences between secular democracy, which the West, of course, thinks is the best in the world, and the Islamic understanding of political rule, which is very profound, very theological, and a very interesting alternative. And maybe its time has come for many people in the world actually to look again at the Islamic alternative. So I'm going to be reading a few paragraphs from this book, Islam and Politics. There's a foreword by Prince Ghazi of Jordan. I do actually recommend this book. It's a very interesting read indeed. And right at the beginning of the book, we have a chapter entitled The Islamic Concept of Government. And the author, or what also mention who he is actually, Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani, a very famous scholar, is one of the world's most prominent scholars of the Islamic sciences. And he's a former justice of the High Court of Pakistan. I think he's in his 80s now, but he's still teaching. And there's a big Wikipedia article about his very distinguished life and career. So he writes in his book on page 29, one cannot fully understand the injunctions and guidelines Islam has given about politics and government until one has a correct understanding of the concept of government. And the most important basic principle is that Allah is the true sovereign of this universe and all that is in it. So that's a really, talk about taking it back to basics. It's starting with God himself being the sovereign and owner of the entire universe. What a place to begin a book on politics. That's how radical Islam is. Radical in the original sense of taking something back to its roots, to the foundations, rather than kind of a superficial level. He continues, worldly rulers rule only as a consequence of their sovereignty and in subservience. So immediately, politics is theocentric in Islam. It's not secular. This is the basic principle which allows neither any difference of opinion nor ijtihad of any kind. Ijtihad is like reasoning, independent thought. Nor can it be ignored in any instance, nor can there be any negotiations on this very point. So the idea that God is true sovereign of the entire universe. This is the first and most fundamental article of an Islamic constitution, which has been stated more than once by the Holy Qur'an in clear and unambiguous terms. And he quotes half a dozen verses. I just mentioned two of them really in English. Truly, all sovereignty belongs to Allah. That's chapter 6, verse 57. In another place, we read, so remember, to him belongs all sovereignty, 662. And then he mentions some others. All these ayah, these are kind of verses, show that sovereignty over the whole universe belongs to Allah alone. Secular democracy, however, presumes that the right to rule belongs to the people. Rulership or government means having the right to make decisions and issue edicts without being dependent on anyone else. That right belongs to no one but Allah, he says. If one considers anyone else as a ruler in this sense, one will be guilty of having ascribed partners to Allah. This is a serious, serious sin in Islam. The actual meaning of theocracy, this is a word in the West, particularly theocracy, which is a really triggering word, you know, the idea of rule by priests or bishops or mullahs, and everyone hates it. It's just unacceptable. The actual meaning of theocracy is that rule belongs to God. But as has already been mentioned, this is earlier in the book, in Judaism, Christianity, and Hinduism, there was no proper way of implementing this concept. So it has often degenerated into unbridled rule by religious leaders. So I mentioned, you know, cardinals or bishops. The time of the French Revolution in 1789, of course, one of the big targets of the French revolutionaries was the church, the Catholic Church, because a certain cardinal and the hierarchy in the church basically ruled France along with the king, and people hated them because they were unjust and they oppressed the poor and so on. So this is what people have in mind when they think of theocracy. They think of priests and bishops and the church ruling, but that's not what Islam means, of course, by the concept. So the consequence, though, is that no one thinks of the rule of God when he hears the word theocracy. They just think of men basically ruling in the name of God. What comes to mind, he says, is instead rule by religious leaders. Exactly. Theocracy has been translated as rule by religious leaders in Urdu books on politics. But to give religious leaders the status of real rulers instead of Allah is the worst form of associating partners with God. The Holy Qur'an severely rejects it. And he quotes from a verse, "They have taken their rabbis and priests as lords besides Allah," 9:31. So this kind of Western concept of theocracy as ruled by the cardinals, the church, is completely rejected in the Quran. And indeed, they condemn for taking their priests as lords besides Allah. So this idea of theocracy in that sense is completely rejected, obviously, in Islam. Hence, the most fundamental principle underlying Islamic politics is to acknowledge that the ultimate ruler is Allah, not the church, not hierarchy, not men, but God, who is the owner and sovereign of the universe. He has obviously the right to do that. This has nothing to do with rule by religious leaders, which Christianity adopted in the name of theocracy, and which became so notorious that people now do not even want to hear its name. Theocracy is just anathema to people in the West. In Islam, on the other hand, the rule of God has kept its proper meaning. Its obvious implication is that whatever commands and guidelines Allah Most High has given to men, whether in the form of the Holy Quran or noble hadiths, are the first and foremost sources on which an Islamic government is to rely. The government is not permitted to make a law that contravenes them or to take any steps that do not conform to these guidelines. It is much more centered around law than ruled by a clerical class of imams or priests or cardinals or church people. Quite different. In short, he says, the acknowledgement that the ultimate sovereignty belongs to Allah is what distinguishes Islamic politics from secular democracy. I absolutely agree with him. This is a profoundly authentic insight in the difference between the secular, liberal, Western notion, and which often goes back, as acknowledged, to the father of liberalism, this guy, John Locke. There we go. There he is, an Englishman, whose famous work, Second Treatise of Government and A Letter Concerning Toleration, has been extremely influential, not just in Britain, where he obviously lived in England, but in the United States. And words from these books appear even in the American Declaration of Independence, and very influential on the American Constitution, and still very much studied and read at universities by students in America and throughout the world. So you've got to understand the Western view of politics and social contract and the sovereignty of man, individual liberty and tolerance and all that. This is a foundational text by the founder of modern liberalism. By the way, as a complete diversion, by the way, it says on the back cover here, this is published by Oxford University Press. You don't know if you can read it, probably not. Published the letter concerning toleration aimed to end Christianity's wars of religion and call for the separation of church and state so that everyone could enjoy freedom of conscience. Okay, this is what it says on the back. Now, this is Oxford University Press saying it, but bless them, they're wrong. And it's not an opinion, this is a fact, because if you open the book, the letter concerning toleration, John Locke himself says something very different. And he talks about those who are not to be tolerated, not to be shown tolerance in his tolerant society. And who are these people? Well, if you look on page 158 and 159, I've actually highlighted the passage. Those that are not, says John Locke, to be tolerated, these are people who are not to be shown any liberties and tolerance, are those who deny the being of a God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. The taking away of God, though even in thought, dissolves all. What he's saying is that there is no place for atheists in his tolerant society. They are banished. They are not to be tolerated. And in another place, it doesn't end there. I won't bother to read it. You can look it up for yourself. Just Google it. He says that Catholics are not to be tolerated either. So he boasts, or the cover boasts, that John Locke is writing his letter concerning tolerance, aimed to end Christianity's wars of religion. Noble aim, you think. But he still doesn't tolerate Catholics. He's an Anglican from the Church of England, here in London, in England, actually. So actually, what the Oxford University Press said on the back is not accurate. Even this great apostle of liberty denied liberty to Catholics and atheists. Anyway, that's a complete diversion, but I just want to show the irony there. So just to continue, in short, as we've said, the acknowledgement that the ultimate sovereignty belongs to Allah is what distinguishes Islamic politics from secular democracy. In the latter, says our writer, Mufti Uthmani, in the latter, the parliament or other national assembly, in its capacity as public representative body, has the power to enact any law it likes. If the constitution of a country restricts the legislative powers of its parliament, Parliament can remove those restrictions by amending the constitution. The constitutional bases of an Islamic government, however, are the Holy Qur'an and the Sunnah, and they are unalterable. There can be no law or article in the constitution that does not conform to them. Isn't that interesting? Really big difference. When recounting the history of different fields of human intellectual activity, now he goes on here to make a very disturbing point, actually. I don't mean that he's wrong, but anyway, we'll see what he says. When recounting the history of different fields of human intellectual activity, Western writers often fail to mention the contributions made by Muslims. In the case of political science, they begin with Plato and Aristotle, then come to the Christian era, then skip a few centuries and come to Voltaire and Rousseau and so on. There is no mention of the long era of Islamic governments in which a different concept of politics was present. As for political systems of religious origin, they mention only the theocracy of Jews, Christians, and Hinduism. There is no mention of how Islam has made the concept of Allah being the ultimate ruler the basis of its politics, or of what was the foundation of the righteous caliphate or subsequent Islamic governments. Now, is this true, what he's saying? Is it true when you look at the Western understanding of political science, when they write their histories of politics and political philosophy, right back to the time of Plato and Aristotle up to today, do they completely ignore the contribution from Islamic political scientists? Which this is not about Islamic political scientists historically, so I'm not going to go into the details of what they are, but they certainly exist. So let me give an example. This is a fantastic book called On Politics by Alan Ryan, who's professor of political science at Oxford. He was at Princeton before that. A history of political thought from Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, to the present. Okay, it's a big, look how fat that book is. I can tell you it is 1,110, over 1,110 pages long. It's a whopping great big history. Yeah, you think, great, it's going to have something about Islam, isn't it? So you open up the contents page, and there are 27 chapters in this 1,000-page book. And here is the contents. And this, by the way, is a fabulous reviews, outstanding introduction to political science. So book one, Herodotus to Machiavelli. So it starts from Herodotus, Plato, Aristotle, just as Mufti said. Then it talks about the Roman insights, Cicero, Augustine, Two Cities, great book. Then talks about the Christian world, Augustine, Aquinas. Then on to humanism, Reformation, Machiavelli. And then book 2, it goes to Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, the brilliant English liberal writer. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, of course, Rousseau, French Revolution, American Revolution, utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, democracy, Karl Marx. And then the 20th century talks about socialism, democracy, etc. Not once does it mention Islamic government in this massive tome by one of the world's leading political scientists from Oxford University, a professor there. I mean, it's a great read. I haven't read it all, but actually what Mufti Usmani says, actually true. And this, he says, this is the outcome of the prejudice the West has towards Islam and Muslims. Intellectual integrity and honesty, however, require that at the very least one would mention the Islamic concept of politics, even if only as a theory, and the governments that were established according to that concept. And he's right, actually, I think. He's absolutely right. Leading works just fail to... You've got over 1,000 pages there. You can devote at least one fig leaf of a page to Islamic governance. Nothing at all. So this is basically about Western theories of politics in a Western context. It doesn't say that in the book. It talks about it as a universal history, and it's not. Anyway, so back to our book, page 31. Faith in Allah's ultimate sovereignty is an extremely important principle that causes a number of facts to become clear almost on its own. Take the theory of social contract. Now, because social contract theorists often refer to this book. John, he doesn't use the term social contract, he talks about the compact, but it means the same thing. John Locke is one of the great founders, if not the founder, of this understanding of social contract. The theory of social contract, which relates to the beginning of government, is the most popular theory in this regard today. The principle that ultimately sovereignty belongs to Allah is entirely contradictory to this theory and shows it to be without foundation. In fact, it is nothing but the invention of creative minds and is not in the least proved by circumstantial evidence. This is an important point here he's making. The questions are, he says, who was there when the social contract came into being? It's the agreement between people, basically, to form a basis of government. Who was there when the social contract came into being? When did this contract come into being? Between which nations was it made? Who were the parties to this contract? There is no one who could answer these questions with confidence. There has only been made up a theory. It's a made-up theory that perhaps this was how things happened. It is this kind of approach regarding which the Quran says they have no knowledge of that. They are merely guessing. That's 43:20. Now, I've read this book, a second treatise of government, where this social contract theory, as we now call it, is discussed. And he doesn't give any answers to these questions. And I remember reading this thinking, well, it's all very nice, this theory, but what's the evidence for it? Well, when did this social contract come into being? Who originally came about with this idea? Which people in which historical period? Who were they? He never mentions this, John Locke, in his book. And he is the founder, he's the universally acknowledged founder of liberalism. So the Quran is actually spot on. They have no knowledge of that. They are merely guessing. 43:20. And then Mufti continues, on the other hand, the principle according to which Allah is the ultimate ruler tells us that when Allah created man, he announced, indeed, I shall make a representative on earth. Indeed, I shall make a representative on earth. 2:30, second surah, verse 30. He continues, this clearly shows that the first human being, Adam, came as representative of Allah. Ultimate rulership belonged and belongs to Allah, but he sent the first human being as his representative to rule according to divine guidelines. In other words, this was Adam's duty, his obligation. Other human beings who appeared in due course were his subjects. This is how government came into being, with the appearance of the first man. But the underlying principle of this government was the ultimate sovereignty belonging to Allah. No one has the right to govern in any way that does not accord with the divine commands. Anyone in a ruling position is in fact subject to Allah's ultimate rulership. He represents divine rule on earth, so much and so such a person is called a caliph or khalifa in Arabic. That is why government by an emir, a ruler, is called a caliphate or khalifa. And the emir, the ruler himself, is called a caliph. And then he goes in to discuss the meaning of the khalifa in the Qur'an and the Sunnah. We're not going to go there now because that's a different subject, I think. But I just want to share just one more paragraph on page 35, where he talks about the objectives of the government. And this, again, the objectives of a government in Islam are quite distinct, actually, in some respects, from the objectives of Western governments. And reading this, reading this paragraph again is very refreshing, and I think would appeal to a lot of Westerners, actually, particularly in light of the terrible events that are happening in Gaza and that conflict and the genocide that is happening. Because what does it really mean to have a government now which is complicit, at least, with genocide? So he writes on 35, what are the objectives of government? To promote the well-being of the people and to protect their rights, he says. But you must have noticed that not one of the popular political theories has made it an objective to educate people and to foster goodness and to curb evil. No political theory talks about that, he says. This is because there is no constant concept of good and evil according to them. In today's fashionable philosophies, good and evil are relative terms. In other words, society itself decides through its norms of behavior what is good and what is bad. It is not necessary that a thing that was considered bad yesterday to be considered bad today. Rather, if a certain kind of behavior becomes common in a society and people begin to regard it as good, then this evil behavior will become good. Similarly, if people consider one thing good, it is not necessary that people living in another country also to consider it good. In other words, there is no concept of absolute good and absolute evil. That is why the promotion of virtue and the curbing of vice has not been mentioned among the purposes of government. And you won't find it mentioned in here, in all of these pages. In Islam, on the other hand, there is a reliable and constant standard of good and evil. Anything that the creator of the universe has termed good is good, and anything he has termed evil is evil. Accordingly, the promotion of goodness and the prevention of evil are among the foremost government objectives of the Khalifa system, the Caliphate system. The objectives of government are clearly stated in the Holy Quran itself, and he quotes, "Those who, if we give them power in the land, establish the prayer, pay zakat, enjoin goodness, and forbid evil, and with Allah rests the end of all matters." That's 21:42. So the objectives of government, those who, when God gives people power in the land, they establish prayer. Those are the priorities there: establishing prayer, paying zakah, enjoining goodness, promoting it, encouraging it, instilling it, and forbidding evil. These are the objectives of government, not exhaustive list, but they are the fundamentals. In this ayah, Allah Most High clearly states the purpose of a government is not simply to make people happy, as some government theorists claim. Happiness is, in any case, a rather vague term. Different tempers require different things to be happy. People with criminal minds must commit crimes to be happy. Happiness is an expression that can be used to cover up all kinds of evil. If one considers the governmental objectives stated in the Holy Qur'an, one will come to realize that they suffice to fulfill the true purpose of government. And he goes on to talk about establishing the prayer. And this is the Islamic concept of government, establishing the prayer and the payment of zakah, enjoining good, forbidding evil, just as we have read in the Quran itself. So then finally, I just want to share with you briefly some interesting words about making decisions according to the majority view. Obviously, in the West, majorities, at least theoretically, are decisions are made according to majority votes. So he starts on page 98 by saying, what role does the majority view play in the Holy Sharia? This is Islamic law. Is the decision of the advisory body only to be considered to be binding if it's unanimous, or can a decision be implemented that has been backed by the majority? And he starts, as already mentioned, in a democracy, the majority view determines what is right and what is wrong, and everything is decided in the light of the majority view. Muhammad Iqbal, the poet of the East, as he says, aptly remarked, and he quotes from 2 lines of a poem that he wrote. Democracy is a form of government in which people are counted instead of being weighed. Democracy is a form of government in which people are counted instead of being weighed. Wow, that's a fantastic quote. It's such a profound thing to say. In other words, writes our writer, in a democracy, no account is taken of people's individual characteristics. It's purely a matter of how many people hold which opinion. But when one looks at the injunctions of the Holy Quran and the Sunnah, it becomes clear that when it comes to deciding what is right or lawful, or what is wrong or unlawful, it does not matter in the least what opinion the majority of people have. The Holy Quran explains the reason for this in a forthright manner. So there's a reason for this. What does the Quran, what does the word of God itself tell us the reason is? Quote, were you to follow the majority of those on earth, they would make you stray from the path of Allah. They follow only their own opinions, and they are merely speculating. That's Quran 6:116. Boom, there's words, hit one hard. Were you to follow most people on earth, they would make you stray far from the path of God. They follow only their own ideas, and they are merely speculating. That's my brief paraphrase there in English. How amazing. Hence, the majority view does not influence the decision as to what's right and wrong. Such decisions are to be made on the basis of what the Holy Quran and the Sunnah say about an issue. Once the Holy Sharia has given its verdict, the issue is not to be reviewed in the light of the opinions held by the majority. The late Iqbal said about this kind of majority view, and he quotes the poet of the East again. The brains of 200 donkeys cannot produce one human thought. The brains of 200 donkeys cannot produce one human thought. This does not mean that the majority view is altogether worthless, but that it is simply not called for in matters where the Sharia has decided already. And then he goes on to mention a few caveats, which I won't go into now on page 99. So I think that's probably enough, half an hour. I do recommend this book, Islam and Politics, Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani. It's published by Taruth Publishing in the UK, actually. And it's not very long. It's full of this guy's a brilliant scholar. He's very clear, actually. His concepts, his exposition is very interesting, and it's the flow is great, and I do recommend it. Anyway, till next time.